Well, the number of Jews in Poland is very small, but the small numbers doesn't make them insignificant. But the important point is that we're telling the story where it happened. That's very powerful. That is enormously powerful, and we want to harness the emotional power of the site where the museum is actually located. And finally, we're a site of conscience. We want to create a trusted zone for engaging difficult subjects. We are on a site of genocide, in addition to being on the site of the largest Jewish community in Europe. And what we want to do is to provide such a rich and deep and responsible history that our visitors will trust us and be willing to engage with very difficult subjects, because there are many, many difficult moments in this story. So those are our meta-historical principles. So this is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at its biggest, strongest, most diverse. And you can see that it includes territory that is today Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarusia, parts of Russia, and other areas. So it's really, really huge. And our story unfolds in the territories that are defined in each historical period as Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, partitions, and then, of course, Second Polish Republic, occupied Poland, and post-war Poland. This is a very, very, for me, this is a very, very moving statement. And very, for me, it's a hallmark of our approach. Perhaps the dry crust and tranquility of these lands is preferable where hatred does not overcome us like in the German lands. May it continue thus until the Messiah comes. That was written in the 16th century. In the 16th century by Rabbi Moses Isserles, known as the Ramu, who was perhaps the greatest rabbi in this, in Poland, certainly, in this territory, but also whose notes to the Code of Jewish Law, this Code of Jewish Law guides Jewish life to this very day for observant Jews. That's an extraordinary story. And what he's really saying is that in the rest of Europe, Jews are being expelled from cities, accused of the plague, accused of blood libel, of host desecration, of poisoning wells, and that they fled east for safety. And that although in the early modern period, it was not such a bed of roses, it was a lot better than Western Europe. And that's an extraordinary, extraordinary statement. So, museums as agents of transformation, how? First of all, what is the story they tell? And that's a question you can ask at every single museum that you go to. That is to say, narrative museums, history museums. What is the story they tell? And I think it would be fascinating, go to the Warsaw Uprising Museum, go to the website of the Museum of Polish History. Because those are narrative. Great, because I think, and think to yourself, what is the story they're telling? Is it a master narrative? Does it basically have one through line with one message? Is it an open narrative? And that's something to think about for every single museum, number one. Number two, how do they tell the story? In our case, we start from the premise that this is a dynamic environment for visitors to explore and not a place where a guide marches you through and tells you exactly what to think. And how does the museum engage the public? Is it a passive public that comes to, in a sense, absorb what's there, or is it an active public? And an active public is a public that can be transformative. That's the key, an active public. And I want to give you an example of what an active public looks like. And that is in just a moment. So, but first, the narrative approach of this exhibition, because this narrative approach is what I would call a critical museology, and it's an approach that produces an open narrative, open questions, and that is intended to produce an experience for the visitor that is memorable, emotional, and thought-provoking. Thought-provoking, not mind-numbing, thought-provoking. So, first of all, it's not a defensive history that we tell. We don't start from everything that's wrong with what the visitor thinks and build a narrative that will correct their misperceptions. So we don't start from anti-Semitism, we don't start from stereotypes, we don't start from, if you will, in a sense, having to defend against misperceptions on the part of our visitor. We actually start from the point of view that our visitors are people that are intelligent, people of good faith, people who are open, and we may not agree with their preconceptions, but we respect them, and we are not going to let, if you will, things that are wrong be the basis for constructing our narration. So we don't do that. It's not an apologetic history. What's an apologetic history? Apologetic histories of Jews go back at least to the 17th century, if not earlier. But certainly, apologetic histories are histories that show that Jews are really good, smart, Nobel Prize winners, that they have somehow or other, they're so exemplary that we should love them. I mean, that's to put it to put it in a very crude way. But apologetic histories essentially are histories that are, if you will, celebratory in so far as they really show the worthiness of those whose story they tell. We don't start from that position. Of course, there will be famous people, great achievements, but that's not our starting point. Our starting point is not to, in a sense, again, in a sense defensive, but this time not against what's negative, but in favor of what's positive. We don't do that either. It's not a teleological history. That is to say, it's not a history that drives to one endpoint. And it certainly doesn't drive to the Holocaust as an endpoint. In fact, one of the things we try to do, particularly with the pre-war period, is to present it in a way that goes against the way it's usually presented. It's usually presented as on the brink of disaster. Like the Holocaust is on its way. And what we try to do is to really stay inside the period and try to understand how those in the period understood what was going on in their world and wider. But I can assure you, they didn't think of themselves on the brink of disaster with the Holocaust on its way. And so we try very much not to drive inevitably towards a kind of, if you will, already known endpoint. And that's very important. No master narrative we've talked about, and it's not a contextual history, which is to say, what I mean by that is this. When I think of contextual history, I think of what was originally proposed, which is, in a sense, a Polish context, and you put Jews in it. But Jews are not a footnote to Polish history. And what that means is that we have to think differently about what it means to tell an integral history, a history that I think of as being relational without being a history of Polish-Jewish relations, which is to say that it's not about Poland that has these little pockets of other people. It's actually a completely different conception of the history of Poland, and it's a history that I think Polish visitors will absolutely recognize and understand, because it's a history of Poland, but from a very different perspective. So Jews are not a footnote to Polish history. We don't create something called a Polish context and put Jews into it, but rather we produce what I think of as an integrated and integral history, a relational history, and a history that is open-ended. We think of it as the open-ended past. It's not a closed story. It's not a closed story in terms of being able to draw some final conclusion, but it's also not a story that's over. And so now, what does it mean to engage a public? I want to just very quickly show you what is, from my point of view, the absolute gold standard in terms of engaging a public. And it's our beautiful Gwoździec project. We call it Gwoździec reconstruction. And what happened was this. Basically, wooden synagogues, there were hundreds of them in this territory. And they were the glory of, I would call, if you will, Jewish architecture. Masonry synagogues are great too. But the Polish wooden synagogues are out of this world. When you see the external architecture, the internal painting, they're just fabulous. They're gone. They're absolutely gone. Some of them, they're wooden structures, so some of them just burnt down. But whatever was left, the Germans destroyed. So by the time World War I was underway, by the time the Germans occupied Poland, the last of the wooden synagogues are gone. But we worked with a studio in Massachusetts called Hans House Studio. And they specialize in what they call the recovery of lost objects. And what they say, and it's actually, to tell you the truth, it's a very Japanese approach. I know that will sound strange, but there's something called the Jingju Shrine that says that it's 800 years old and never more than 20 years old. Why? Every 20 years, they tear it down. Now, why would you tear down a so-called 800-year-old structure? Why? Because they value the knowledge of how to build it more than the original material. And they know that the only way that they can transmit the knowledge of how to build it is by building it. And to create the necessity for building it, they tear it down. Now, of course, we're not about to tear anything down, but we don't have it to start with. And so what Hans House Studios said is they said, we can never recover the original material, but we can recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it. And that is, and that's what we did. And this, as you know from the film, is the centerpiece of the 18th century gallery. This is the Gwoździec wooden synagogue. It once stood in Gwoździec, which is now in the Ukraine, that was near Lvov and near Kolomea. And it's really, I mean, I think the exterior is great, but actually there are other wooden synagogues where the exterior is even greater. And we have from the 19th century, actually from the 1890s, a painting of part of the interior so we know what colors it was. And what we did was a whole series of workshops, and we used this architectural drawings. This synagogue was very badly destroyed during World War I, actually. So our documentation is pre-World War I, and this is Alois Breyer's cutaway. And what's fabulous, this is the Eastern Wall with the ark for the Torah scrolls. This is the bima, which is the reader's platform. And in the this synagogue was created originally in the 17th century and renovated in the 18th century. And they did a cutaway to create this beautiful cupola. And we have 100% scale bima and 85% scale of just the ceiling and the roof. And the bima is as beautifully painted as the synagogue itself. And then we used historical photographs of the timber framing inside and of all, and this is like, it is a horror of empty spaces. Every single millimeter of this interior was painted with texts, with images. So what do? We went to Sanok, we went to the Folk Architecture Museum, and we had delivered to us raw logs with the bark still on. And this is the site where we started. And we assembled, in the course of 2 summers, over 300 people to help us to create the synagogue. And the first step was to do the timber framing, to strip the logs of bark, and to make the planks, and to put together the actual wooden structure. And these timber framers came from the US, other parts of Europe, and they brought their traditional tools with them in golf bags and ski bags. I don't know, can you imagine going through security at the airport with these tools? This looks like Lord of the Rings or something, Harry Potter or something extraordinary. So these are their tools, these traditional tools. And these tools are from different timber framing traditions, and each hand that holds a tool makes a different mark. So in effect, every single wooden element is signed, if you will, by the hand and the tool that actually shaped the wood. And they did like this, pit saws, traditional lathes, and the whole structure, you'll see it downstairs, is put together with wooden pegs. So it's like a puzzle. And we put it together, we put the whole thing together in 6 weeks, actually. We put it together, and then took it apart, numbered the parts, shipped them to Warsaw, put them in the bottom of the building, and then, we'll show you in a moment, the next summer, we painted the panels. And we painted the panels in existing synagogues in cities and towns across the length and breadth of Poland. From Gdańsk, Sejna, Kazimierz Dolny, Rzeszów, Szczebrzeszyn, Kazimierz Krakow, and we invited local communities to come in, see the workshops, attend lectures, and to feel a sense of ownership of what was created there that would be part of our museum, but also to take an interest in their synagogue and in the Jewish past of their town. And so this was the White Stork Synagogue in Wrocław. It's really absolutely, we did 2 workshops there. Is this not fabulous? This is just absolutely stunning. My personal favorite, the bunnies. They are so, can you believe this? Look at this. It's just gorgeous. And then we brought this whole structure to Warsaw and we installed it here. And it is really fabulous. And it's a 25-ton structure. And this, we put this together from the pieces. And then we had to hoist it because it's not standing on legs, it's actually suspended. It's hanging from cables. So that when you're under it, you feel like you're under a celestial canopy. And we did the same thing with the bima. That's the historical bima from this synagogue. And it's 100% scale, and it was painted, and it was gorgeous also. And then it will stand, of course, as a centerpiece of the 18th century gallery, where what we're interested in is, if you will, spiritual yearning, spiritual quest, new forms of religious life, new forms of religious leadership. And this is, if you will, Jewish life in color, because most images that people have of Jewish life before the Holocaust is black and white, as if the grass wasn't also green. There's a sense that from this black and white photographs that it was a gray world, but it wasn't. It was in living color. So now, quickly, an international perspective. So let's start with Bereit Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. It's on the campus of Tel Aviv University. And I would say that this is the museum with the biggest ambition, which is to be a museum of the Jewish people worldwide. And of course, and the Knesset actually passed a regulation or a statute to the effect that Bereit would be the world center of the Jewish people. So it already gives you a sense that what's critical here is a redefining of the relationship of Israel to the diaspora. And diaspora, the dispersion, essentially, is, if you will, a 2,000 years. The big diaspora is a 2,000-year story. It's actually longer. But what's interesting here is the change of name. Bereit was originally called Museum of the Diaspora. And the change of name tells, because, and Museum of the Diaspora essentially meant that when the diaspora, that Israel, in a sense, brought, if you will, the possibility of the end of the diaspora, because Israel would be the ingathering of Jews from around the world, and the diaspora would shrink, or if not disappear, it would shrink. But this museum opened in the late 70s, and in the 30-some-odd years that have passed, Israel stands in a very different relationship with those who live elsewhere, including those from Israel who have emigrated. There's a very large population of Israelis living in Berlin, for example. And so Museum of Jewish Peoplehood is an effort to redefine the relationship of the State of Israel to Jews living abroad, to Jews living elsewhere. And that is, if you will, if this museum has transformative energy, that's where it's going. So how does it define its mission? This is from Leonid Nevin, chairman of the board, and also a major funder. So it's from diaspora to peoplehood. To convey the unique and ongoing story of Jewish people while giving expression to a new perception about the relationship between the Jewish people and the State of Israel. That's what's transformative. It's this new perspective, and it's a perspective that doesn't divide the diaspora from Israel, but brings forward a sense of Jewish peoplehood that is all-inclusive. That's what they're trying to do. And perception of one Jewish people, and therefore we change the name. So you get a sense of it, and they're creating a new core exhibition, which I think is going to be quite interesting. Let's look at the museum, of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. This is an interesting one also. So this museum succeeded in getting a piece of land on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, which is, if you will, the beginning of the United States. Fundamentally, it's the beginning. It's the Liberty Bell. It's the Constitution. It's, if you will, it's like the Vatican of America. It's different from a capital city. Washington is late. You know, Washington D.C. There was a big debate: would the capital be in Philadelphia or Washington? And it ended up in Washington, pardon me, or New York. It ended up in Washington when Washington had to be actually made up, because there wasn't much there before it was decided to make it into a capital. But Philadelphia is really an old story. And so when this Jewish museum managed to secure a place on Independence Mall, it felt it needed to be part of the narrative of Independence Mall. And the narrative of Independence Mall is a narrative of freedom. And so the National Museum of American Jewish History's mission is to preserve, explore, celebrate the history of Jews in America, connect them to their heritage, inspire in people of all backgrounds a great appreciation for diversity of the American Jewish experience and the freedoms to which Americans aspire. And freedom is the big idea. Now what happens here, which is really interesting, is first of all, diversity of the American Jewish experience is first and foremost. Have a look at the Museum of Polish History and see whether diversity is a primary message. In the American context, and from a minority perspective, and from a Jewish perspective, Diversity, this is a country of immigrants. And if you will, Poland's a country of immigrants. It's a really different situation. Western Europe is now very diverse. Before the war, it wasn't. Eastern Europe, this area, our territory, before the war was very diverse. And now it isn't. Not anywhere like what it was. It's a complete inversion. But in the American context, the issue of diversity is huge. And the idea of freedom becomes the dominant, if you will, organizing concept for this entire exhibition. Our museum illustrates how freedom and its choices, challenges, and responsibilities fostered an environment in which Jews were able to accomplish truly extraordinary things. And since other immigrant ethnic groups have faced similar challenges, the museum is a place for all Americans to explore. And what I would say here is that I found very interesting the positioning of Europe. Europe is dark, persecution, economic hardship. America is the land of opportunity. That's the fundamental narration, as if you can well imagine. And you can understand here that this is rather more about American citizenship and the place of ethnic minorities within that wider, diverse society. Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's really interesting also. And it's located in Lower Manhattan in New York. And it's a six-sided building for the six-sided star, the 6 million who perished. But what's fascinating for me here is its mission, to educate people of all ages and backgrounds about the broad tapestry of Jewish life in the 20th and 21st centuries, before, during, and after the Holocaust. In other words, the Holocaust is at the very center, and it's 20th century because it's before the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, and the Holocaust, which means that it's not like our 1,000-year story. Basically, the Holocaust is at the center, and then before and after are defined by that center. And it's understandable because it's fundamentally a Holocaust museum. That truly is its starting point. It is a living memorial to the Holocaust. And here, what I find so interesting is that the first floor is the period in the 20th century before the Holocaust. Second floor is the Holocaust, very good exhibition, marvelous objects, very, very clearly organized. For me, from my point of view, in a small space they've done a great job. And after the Holocaust, which is the third floor, at least when they opened, I have to go back and see what it's like now. When they opened, after the Holocaust, was only America and Israel, no Europe. Europe was over. From a American Jewish perspective, the Holocaust was the end. Europe was over. And so when you're on that third floor, and you've gone through the post-war period, and you're about to exit, this is your view. What do you see? Anybody recognize what you see? Come on, you know what you see. What do you see?
Statue of Liberty.
Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. And that's the narrative. The way the building itself is positioned, and the way the story unfolds in space, and the way the story, in a sense, takes you to this vista, is, in a sense, it makes it an American story. And I mean, the same could be said, actually, with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, which is also, there's a way in which it ends with the Americans liberating the camps, which makes it, if you will, a battle fought in Europe, but, quote, also an American story. What about Yad Vashem? Let's go to Jerusalem. Yad Vashem, Yad Vashem, of course, is the world center for Holocaust studies, museums, commemoration, and it's incredible. And they've done they have a new building and a new exhibition. This is Moshe Safdie's building, which is wonderful. And when you've passed through the entire story of the Holocaust, what is your vista? The city of Jerusalem. So clearly, this museum integrates the Holocaust into the national narrative. And it does it in a way that museums do. It does it spatially. It does it visually. It does it in terms of the path that you walk. It does it in the way in which the climactic moment at the end gives you this kind of vista. So your vista is, your vista might be Independence Mall, your vista might be Ellis Island Statue of Liberty, your vista might be Jerusalem. What about the Jewish Museum in Berlin? Now that's interesting. So I happen to be a big fan How many of you have been, has anybody been to this museum? I recommend it. Berlin's not that far away. Honest. It's 5 hours in the train. It's worth it. This museum, this is Daniel Liebeskind's building, which is really, I think, a masterpiece of architecture. But as you can see, it's a zinc exterior, and it's a very, very big zigzag. And basically, the architecture itself, inside and out, says Holocaust. But it's the Jewish Museum Berlin, and it's a 2,000-year history. How did they get 2,000 years and we only got 1,000? They start with the Romans. There were no German Jews at the time of the Romans. But that's okay. They start, I mean, they managed somehow or other. I think if we dug deep enough and hard enough, we could probably go back earlier. But 1,000 years is enough to deal with. So 2,000 years of the history of German Jews. However, that entire story is within this very Holocaust architecture. Now, what's the evolution of their project? It's quite interesting because you have to see it in relationship to the reunification of the two German states and the transfer of the government from Bonn to basically to Berlin. And it's a really different situation than in Poland, and that's what makes it so interesting for comparison. And the combination of the German crimes of the Nazi era and the whole Cold War and communist era really, I think, made it quite difficult to figure out what to do. There was also a plan for the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe and the topography of terror, and then the sense that the Jewish Museum could be complementary to those other memorials. And in fact, it's very strongly memorial. We try very hard to separate history from memorial. Our memorial is the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto heroes. And our museum is a museum of the history of Polish Jews. But other sites, like this one, mix the two. Warsaw Uprising Museum mixes the two. And that's one of the things we try not to do. And finally, which is very interesting in terms of their evolution, and that is that if they started in the 70s, by 2013, they've created what they call the Jewish Museum Berlin Academy. And what is their mission? To focus on migration and intercultural diversity. That's really, really interesting shift away from Holocaust and towards contemporary German society, which is very much about immigration and with huge, huge issues around migrant workers, guest workers, and particularly from Turkey and from other places. And so most recently, they did a very interesting exhibition called The Whole Truth, which you always wanted to know about Jews and were afraid to ask. And it was quite provocative, and what was most provocative was they had a glass box with a chair, and for 2 hours on a Sunday, they put a Jew in the box, and you could ask the Jew any question you wanted. It was quite provocative, but you know what was really great was that apparently one Sunday there was a guy in the box, and a journalist was there with a Holocaust survivor who lives in Berlin, and they chatted a bit. And then she went up and she got into the box and sat beside the guy and took questions. So it was really very provocative and very, very, very interesting, which I think tells you there's something about the evolution of this museum. And then finally, the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. It's a project of the Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia led by Chabad Lubavitch Hasidim. If you can imagine such a thing. And it is fascinating. I was there in February. Really, really interesting. Anybody been to Moscow? It's about 2 hours in a plane. I recommend it. I think this is really, really worth a visit. So first of all, it's in a great industrial building, which is the work of a Russian constructivist architect from the 1920s. And it is considered to be industrial architectural heritage. Great building, and it was a big, huge bus garage, essentially. And so it's just enormous and completely open space. And so this gives you a little bit of a sense of how it's organized inside. It was created by an American designer, Ralph Applebaum, who's one of the biggest, most important, and most accomplished designers, exhibition designers in the world. And it essentially starts with Genesis. So it's not 2,000 years, not 1,000 years, not 2,000 years, more than 5,000 years. It starts with Genesis, and in a sense with the story of the Jewish people, the diaspora, and then with the partitioning of Poland and the Russian partition, which is how Russia got its Jews. And in fact, the story doesn't really get started until the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is partitioned. And when Russia gets that chunk of the Commonwealth, then and it got the biggest piece, bigger than Austria, bigger than Prussia, that's when it gets a huge Jewish population, which it never had before. And that's, in a sense, where the story starts. And so, but the truly Russian story, from the point of view of this museum, doesn't start until after World War I. And so it's quite a different approach. But what's fascinating for me is this, and that is, I believe that this museum tells a story that is actually oppositional in its own way. And its mission, its primary audience, in fact, is Jewish. There are, depending on who you ask, 75,000, 150,000, even maybe more Jews living in the Moscow area, which is, I think, a city of something like 15 million. It's enormous. The city's absolutely enormous. So there is really a critical mass of Jews living in Moscow. And Chabad Lubavitch is extremely interested in, if you will, strengthening Jewish religious observance. And so when we were visiting and we asked, who is this museum for? They said, well, first of all, it's for Jews, because not all Jews go to the synagogue. We'll meet them in the museum. And second, of course, for a general Russian public. And it's really clear what's for whom. For the Russian public, they think that the Bible stories will be interesting, the World War II films, and the Tolerance Center. And for the Jewish visitors, what's fascinating for me is that there is a kind of, basically, the centerpiece of this is the small Jewish town of the 18th and 19th century, and to some degree 20th century, that represents, for this museum, a kind of paradise lost. A paradise lost of places where Jews formed a critical mass and lived an integral Jewish way of life. And how was it lost? It was lost to assimilation, and it was lost to communism. And the recovery of that Jewish way of life and the holding fast to it is in fact the DNA of this museum. It's really different from our museum. It's different from Berlin. So here you get a sense of it. So they've numbered the sections. So number 1 is Genesis, and then number 2 is Diaspora, and I'm not sure about number 3. I think it must be Shtetl, but number 4 is what's interesting: Judaism, a living religion. And this is, for me, the real key to this exhibition. And what really this museum is really saying is, despite everything, despite assimilation, despite repression, despite anti-Semitism, despite communism, Judaism remains a living religion. And this is absolutely at the heart of their mission, and it explains how this whole entire exhibition is organized. And then the sort of historical, I would say, perimeter of the building deals more with what you would expect from a history museum, which is period by period, but largely through this multimedia, which is really great. They're really very, very, I think, excellent. So museums can make a difference, and you have to come back in 2014 when we open the core exhibition. There you go. So. I don't know if you're like completely blitzed or you have any questions or comments. I would love some questions and comments. Can you, like even 2 minutes worth? Come on, don't be shy. And you can even, no, it has to be in English. I know it's American Studies. But let me ask this. Would you bring your friends? Yes? Yes? Maybe? No? Just, yes? And do you think the Polish public will be interested in this museum? I'm just curious. Do you think? Oh, you're very shy. Nobody wants to say anything.
They should be.
They should be. They should be, but will they be? That's the question.
It's Polish people. It's hard to say.
Hard to say. But let's say, let me ask this. Did you have any expectations before you came here as to what this museum would be? Did you have some idea? Like either from the press or... Had anybody visited here before? Or is this your first visit? It's your first visit, right? For the most part. Okay, this is going to be really difficult. I give up. So, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to walk with you a little bit around the building. Maybe we do that.